Good morning. The hearing board of the South Coast Air Quality Management District is in session. Today is Thursday, December 13th, 2018. The time is just after 9 o'clock a.m., and we are meeting in the hearing board room in Diamond Bar. We have one change to the schedule this morning, and that is SCAQMD versus Providence Tarzana Medical Center, case number 6128-1 for an order for abatement has been rescheduled to December 18th. And we have, that means one matter on for this morning, and that is Kinsbursky Brothers, Inc., case number 6122-1 for a regular variance. And who is representing Kinsbursky Brothers this morning?
Good morning, Madam Chair. Christopher Foster on behalf of Kinsbursky Brothers, Inc.
Good morning, Mr. Foster. And who is representing the executive officer this morning?
Nancy S. Feldman for the executive officer.
Good morning, Ms. Feldman.
Good morning.
And we've received. Yeah, I was gonna mark it, but why don't we go ahead?
Yeah, I just wanted to disclose I've been to the facility about 22 years ago with an inspector and I think the permit engineer at that time. So, but that should not affect how I rule on the hearing today.
I assume, Mr. Foster, do you have any objection?
Not at all.
And Ms. Feldman?
No objection.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Balagopalan, for putting that on the record. We have received variance conditions. Is this Mr. Foster, Ms. Feldman, whose exhibit is that?
It can be petitioner's exhibit,
Okay.
but
So-
it reflects the discussion and agreement between the petitioner and the district.
Okay, thank you very much. We will mark those proposed conditions as exhibit number 1. And to begin, I'm going to ask anyone who wishes to testify in this morning's proceeding to please rise to be sworn in. Please raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you. Mr. Foster, your opening, please.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the hearing board. My name is Christopher Foster, and I'm here on behalf of Kinsbursky Brothers, Inc., regarding KBI's petition for a regular variance from 2 requirements of District Rule 1420. KBI recycles large industrial batteries at its facility in Anaheim. Rule 1420, as most recently amended on December 1st, 2017, regulates, among other things, lead point sources and lead processing operations, both of which occur at KBI's facility. KBI seeks a variance from 2 particular requirements of Rule 1420. Number 1, that emissions from lead point sources be vented to an emission control device of a specific efficiency within 6 months of the district's issuing a permit to construct the emission control device. And 2, that lead processing operations be conducted within a total enclosure no later than 12 months after December 1st, 2017. Despite diligent efforts to comply with these deadlines, efforts that began even before the most recent amendment to Rule 1420 in December of 2017, KBI has not met the total enclosure deadline, and based on the most recent construction schedule, will not meet the emission control device deadline. However, the particular operation at issue in the petition for variance.
That's a good reminder. Everyone, please just make sure your phones are silenced. Thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Foster.
However, the particular operation at issue in the petition for variance, lead acid battery processing, as well as the totality of KBI's operations, do not create any excess emissions of lead. In fact, without the total enclosure and emission control device currently being installed at KBI's facility, the ambient air concentrations of lead are significant below the limits imposed by Rule 1420 beginning on January 1st, 2021. KBI has worked closely with district engineering and permitting staff to ensure that the emission control device and total enclosure will meet all the specifications and requirements of Rule 1420. KBI has also worked with the district staff to create a list of operating conditions to be observed during the variance period to ensure the protection of human health and the environment. Through its testimony and exhibits, KBI will establish the basis for the hearing board to make the 6 findings required to approve a variance pursuant to Health and Safety Code Section 42352. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foster. Ms. Feldman, your opening.
Yes, thank you. The district does not oppose the granting of variance here today. And in my opening, I want to make just a couple of points because I'm going to assume that the hearing board reacted in a similar manner that I did when I saw the petition, which is to go on high alert whenever you see lead, and particularly a facility that is characterized as a lead battery recycling facility. We've just had too many bad experiences with facilities like this. KBI processes lead acid batteries, and they are considered to be a battery recycler, and which is why they're subject to the rule requirements, but they don't melt lead at this facility. There's no metal melting taking place. They're disassembling the batteries, and that's why we consider them to be processing lead, and that's what subjects them to the requirements of the rule. They remove the lead plates, so they're considered to be a lead processing facility subject to Rule 1420. As you'll hear, I'm sure, from the petitioner, they have a record of their emissions and monitoring results, which will give the hearing board the comfort they need to make a determination that they are well below any kind of rule limits. But Rule 1420F requires that the owners of lead processing facilities vent emissions from each lead point source to an emissions control device within 6 months after the permit to construct is issued, and to conduct all lead processing operations in a total enclosure no later than 12 months after December 1st, 2017. It's my understanding that KBI worked with the district to determine how it would meet these requirements. In late March, they submitted an application, for permits for their enclosure, and invested a significant amount of resources towards the construction. They applied for local permits from Anaheim, and Anaheim, the building, fire, and planning departments, and it's the delays in getting permitting which brings them here today, not from the district, from the localities that will require permits for the construction of the total enclosure. The hearing board has heard cases like this before, where local permits result in a facility not meeting a district rule deadline, despite the fact that they started the process quite early in the year. So it is for this reason that the district is not opposed to the granting of the variance here today. It's our impression that KBI has done everything it needed to do to come into timely compliance with district rule requirements, and it was other circumstances beyond their reasonable control, which is resulting in a delay.
Thank you, Ms. Feldman, and thank you for how you have phrased the matter for probably a very edgy board. I appreciate that. Mr. Foster, your first witness.
Thank you. First witness is Bruce Armbruster.
If it's factual, wait until they have witnesses. But if then you should wait till they have a witness.
No, it's my question is simple, if you permit me.
Okay.
If they're not smelting lead, then why do they need an enclosure in the first place? They just disassemble
The
it.
rule applies to all facilities that process lead. Because they disassemble the batteries under the rule requirements, they are considered to be processing lead subject to the rules requirements.
But they're not smelting lead.
They're not smelting, no. And they will give a detailed description of their operations for you so that you'll have clarity there.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Foster, your first witness.
Please state your name
Bruce Anthony Armbruster,
and spell the last name. Just
Armbruster.
And did you take the oath earlier this morning in preparation for testimony?
Yes, I did.
Who is your current employer?
JE Compliance Services.
And what's your job title at JE Compliance Services?
I'm Vice President in charge of compliance operations.
And how long have you had that position at JE Compliance Services?
I've been with JE Compliance Services for 29 years.
And if you could just briefly describe your duties in connection with your role at JE Compliance Services.
Again, I work with industrial facilities, assisting them in various compliance issues, specifically related to air quality, wastewater, stormwater, hazardous waste, hazardous materials, and fire code, but various environmental health and safety compliance issues.
Are you familiar with the KBI facility in Anaheim, California?
Yes, I am.
And can you, again, briefly describe consulting and compliance projects that you have been involved with for the KBI facility?
Yes, we work closely with KBI in their efforts to maintain and achieve compliance with various, again, environmental regulations related to air quality, hazardous materials, hazardous waste, including air quality permitting projects, hazardous waste permitting projects, stormwater, et cetera.
Can you, are you familiar with District Rule 1420?
Yes, I am.
And can you briefly describe the operations or equipment that are regulated by 1420 at KBI's facility?
Yes, as previously stated by the district, the process at KBI, it really involves the dismantling of industrial lead-acid batteries. And during that process, the batteries are actually opened. Batteries, when they, I don't know how familiar the board is with what a battery is, but industrial batteries typically include a case, and then within that case, there's a series of cells, and then within those cells, you actually have the lead plates that Kinsbursky is working to remove from those batteries so that they can be recycled. And during that process, they open up the case, and then they will open up the cell manually, typically with a hatchet, and drain from that cell the acid, the electrolyte, and then remove the plates and package those for shipment off-site for further processing.
It's been said that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and without trying to stifle your loquaciousness, let's use some photographs of the facility to help illustrate what goes on at this lead battery processing operation. Madam Chair, can we have marked as the next petitioner's exhibit a set of 7 photographs that have been presented to the board and are with Mr. Armbruster right now up at the overhead projector?
Okay, so you want them marked as just a set?
Yes, that's
Okay.
fine.
So the set of 7 photographs will be marked as exhibit number 2.
Okay, so taking a look at the first photograph in the set of 7 that's been marked as Exhibit 2, can you explain what is going on and what's depicted in that photograph?
In this instance, you see the operator, the employee standing at a table. That's considered the breaking table. And at this location is where the cells, after they've been removed from battery cases, are placed on top of this battery breaking table, and they are addressed with a hatchet to open up one end to allow the employee to access the inner cells or the plates within that cell. And then those cells and the fluid within that cell are drained into that table and collected in this area here, and then the plates are actually stacked for packaging and shipment off-site.
I think if you go to the next photograph, that might help depict the plates.
So you can see here the plates that actually were removed, and that's a lead oxide paste on those cells. It's a wet material, so you don't have generation of dust coming from it because it's a wet process. It remains pretty well intact as they pull those cells out of the, or those plates out of the cells.
And if you go to the next photograph in the series, explain what that depicts.
Those are the actual emptied cells. So once they remove the plates from them, that's, you have left with a plastic cell case. Sure, so these are the cases of the plates are actually within the battery.
And what's the disposition of those cases?
So following the removal of the plates, the cases are washed and the water is collected and directed to an existing wastewater treatment system. The cases then proceed, once cleaned, to a granulation system where they're granulated and the plastic is recycled.
Next photo.
Again, this is just images of what you see here is you'll see the case, and then you can see where the cells within the case are being pulled out. So it gives you an idea of what the cells look like, or the plates look like when they're being removed from the cells.
And again, the plates are the lead-containing aspect of the battery.
That is correct. The plates have a lead oxide paste that's on them.
Okay. Next photo.
This is just another type of industrial battery. Looks a little bit different, but the same process is involved as far as opening that cell and then pulling out the plates. And in this case, because you can see through the case, you can actually see the cells within the, or not the cells, excuse me, the plates within the battery.
Next.
And this again is just another example of an industrial battery, but this is the entire battery, and within it you have the outer steel case. Within that you have individual cells, which you saw being broken on that table earlier, and then within each one of those cells are the lead oxide coated plates.
And can you give some examples of the kind of machine or whatever it is that's being powered by an industrial battery like this one in the picture?
It could be forklifts, it could be submarine batteries, there's different applications.
So Kinsbursky gets batteries from both civilian and military uses.
Yes, that's correct.
Next photo.
And this is simply just a photo or an image, although rather blurry, of some of the equipment that's related to the newly permitted equipment associated with the air control of pollution from the emission lead point source that's just on site waiting to be installed once the permits from the city have been granted and construction completed.
Okay, thanks. You can come sit back down. Were you involved in developing a plan for KBI's compliance with the Rule 1420 as amended in December of 2017?
Yes, as the proposed amended rule was going through working group meetings and discussions, we started the process of evaluating the potential impacts to the operation. At KBI actually had meetings with the district during the rule development process where they toured the facility and we evaluated the operations and how they fit into the rule. And we actually developed a summary of the potential compliance issues so that Kinsbursky could start working towards compliance even before the rule was adopted in its final form.
And what, can you describe briefly the steps that were taken by KBI following the adoption of Rule 1420's most recent amendment in December of 2017?
Well, if I may, I'd like to start with the fact that even before the adoption, they had opened discussions in July and August of 2017 with equipment manufacturers regarding the potential design for air pollution control equipment associated or that would serve the battery braking operations. They went and they actually hired staff engineers and professionals that would help them engineer and design the system, knowing that there was going to be a limited window of time to allow them to do this work. They initiated that process very early on. In addition, they conducted ambient air quality monitoring, and in November of 2017, again prior to adoption of the rule, established what that protocol would look like in the sampling regime. Unfortunately, that wasn't implemented until after the rule was adopted, but that was conducted in January of 2018. So they have ambient air quality monitoring results. The facility was concerned with, do they have a problem? And they wanted to identify if there were any issues immediately, so if they needed to take action, they could. And based on the results of the ambient air quality monitoring that was conducted in January, they found that there wasn't an issue. In fact, the ambient air monitoring results indicate that the lead concentrations in that area are actually an order of magnitude less than what even the 2021 requirements are under the adopted Rule 1420 is adopted on December 1st. Sure. So the ambient air monitoring results that were obtained in January of 2018 indicate that the lead concentrations in the area are actually an order of magnitude, so basically 10 times less than what the rule limits are, even the rule limits as they apply, the more stringent rule limits as they apply in January of 2021.
Air concentration, what's contained in the air at that time?
That's correct.
What is contained?
Well, we're looking at the lead concentrations.
Senator, you're about to receive the monitoring results.
Yes, I've given the clerk, and now being distributed to the board members, a copy of the ambient air monitoring report from sample dates January 4th to January 10th, 2018 at the Kinsbursky facility.
And we will mark this ambient air monitoring report, which is many pages, as Exhibit 3. Yes, although if you could,
Question.
okay.
It's a yes or no. Was this a company, Almega, I guess you pronounce it? Are they a certified company with AQMD?
Yes, they are.
Thank you.
You may continue.
So the results as presented to you there, as reported by Almega, indicate that the average concentration of lead as monitored during this event will range between 0.007 and 0.014 micrograms per cubic meter.
And if I could stop you there, the board will shortly get a one-page document that is a summary of the results from the Almega ambient air monitoring report.
We are receiving a one-page document entitled Kinsbursky Brothers Supply Summary of Ambient Air Monitoring Results. That will be Exhibit number 4.
Thank you. So if you could go through and highlight the results from the air monitoring testing that was done in January, and particularly highlight the comparison between those values, those concentrations, and the regulatory limits.
So in this case, a series of samples were obtained over a one-week period commencing on Thursday, January 4th, 2018. A total of 3 samples were collected over each 24-hour period, one along the east side of the property, one on the west side of the property, and one on the north side of the property. The sampling locations were identified and selected based on meteorological conditions related to wind patterns in the area, and we were looking to try to determine upwind and downwind concentrations of lead in the area. So the east side, primarily or predominantly, the winds will blow from the west to the east in this area. So what we're looking at here in the data is when you look at the east side, we would anticipate that those would be the higher results, where the west side would represent what's coming onto the site from an off-site location. But in all instances, what we see is that even upwind and downwind, the results are very comparable within the same relative order. And in this case, if we go look at the averages over that 7-day period at the east side, the result was 0.007 micrograms per cubic meter. On the west side, 0.014 micrograms per cubic meter, so actually higher than what we would expect it to be. So, and then on the north side, 0.014, consistent again with what we saw on the west side.
Excuse me one
So
moment, Senator.
lead oxide, right?
Well, in this case, it's just elemental lead. Elemental lead, just the element lead itself.
All right. Lead itself, okay.
And when we compare that to the Rule 1420 limit effective December 1st, 2017, and extending through 31 December 2020, 0.15, we see that even the maximums are much less than that limit. And even when we go to the January 1st, 2021 limit of 0.1, we're still an order of magnitude below those limits.
And these monitoring results were collected, or the samples were collected in January of 2018. Is it your understanding that they reflect the current operations and conditions at the facility?
Yes, that's correct.
It's just the lead in natural state, which is not, is there anything else that would contribute to the air quality? Any other chemicals?
From the processes at KBI, is that your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, in this case, we're looking at the lead emissions as being the only thing that could be potentially emitted from that facility as far as toxic air contaminants.
What about airborne from the gases, from the acids?
In this case, the acids are very weak and dilute acids that are captured and, again, directed to a wastewater treatment system where they're neutralized.
What are the acids?
Primarily sulfuric acid.
Sulfuric acid. Yes. And there's some component, sulfur, becomes airborne after a period of time, doesn't it?
Not in the form that you see it within the sulfuric acid. No, the vapor pressures aren't there to liberate it.
Okay.
Okay, please continue.
What are the specific modifications to the facility or KBI's operations that are necessary in order to comply with the applicable requirements of Rule 1420?
In this case, they have the battery braking table, which was illustrated in the image, one of the first image that we showed today, where the employee was standing in front of that battery braking table. And in this case, the system has been designed to actually allow the collection of air from that process. So they're putting collection hoods along the backside of that table that will draw air from in front of the table and across the cells as the batteries are being broken open and into the collection system. Then that collection system will actually be fed to a very large air pollution control device, basically a fugitive emissions control system, what they call a FEF, a fugitive emissions filter. But in order to do this, not only will they be installing the collection system, the ductwork, and the air pollution control device, but they'll be building a room around the existing operations to allow them to better control the airflow and to minimize the potential for fugitive emissions from that process.
The board is now being presented with a bird's eye view or plan drawing of the KBI facility, and indicated in highlighted area is the location of the battery braking operation and what will be installed as the permanent, enclosure around that operation. So if we can put that up on the overhead.
And that is the required total enclosure from Rule 1420?
That's correct.
Thank you.
So if we could have marked as Exhibit 5, I believe it would be the plan drawing of the facility.
Yes, Senator, if it's clarifying.
This is, in the natural state of lead, there's no outgassing at room temperature.
Correct.
The temperature that, right. At what point then is it temperature control at that time?
All the operations are conducted under ambient conditions. There is no heat added to the process, no energy. So the concern in this case is because it's a lead oxide paste, there's a concern that the lead could be emitted as a particulate matter, as a fugitive emissions if entrained in the air through wind. So basically a dust.
And so the acid that's in contact with the lead doesn't cause any chemical reaction?
It's not that it doesn't cause a chemical reaction, but in this case, it's not reacting. It's already been reacted.
But then it becomes airborne. When you separate it, it's exposed to the air.
Again, to become airborne, there would have to be a mechanism that would cause it to be emitted. And in this case, again, it's dilute acid, which has a relatively low vapor pressure. So there is no mechanism that would cause that acid to be emitted into the air.
Well, then that's what, for some reason you need the enclosure, and they have a reason for saying do it. Go ahead.
So in this case, there is an existing canopy over the work area, and in fact, there are walls around the area, but those are not full height walls. And so in order to accommodate the enclosure that will allow them to properly collect the air within this area, this is the battery breaking area along this line here. This is where they're going to be installing a collection system on the back side. The airflow will flow across that collection system or across the battery breaking table into the collection system and then be directed to this unit outside, which is that, again, air filtration system with HEPA and ULPA.
I'm sorry, I did not mark this. This diagram should be marked as Exhibit 5. Sorry.
Thank you.
So the red outline that you see with the shaded area, this will be an area that's totally enclosed, maintained under negative pressure to allow all air in that area to be directed to this, again, very large air filtration system.
Okay, those were all my questions for Mr. Armbruster. I'd like to call my next witness, Paul Johnson.
Before you call your next witness, we'll have questions from Ms. Feldman and the board. Ms. Feldman, questions for Mr. Armbruster.
Yes, thank you. Maybe just one. Does KBI currently conduct its lead processing operations within any kind of enclosure?
It does not.
So there are no walls currently around the lead processing?
There are walls around the exterior of the facility, but around the lead processing area itself, it's not enclosed, and it definitely does not meet the definition of an enclosure or a building, either by the district standards or by City of Anaheim Building Department.
Right, so it wouldn't meet the definition for total enclosure?
Correct.
Okay. You're familiar with Rule 1420 as a consultant? Is that
Yes.
fair to say? Okay. I just want to make it clear on the record as to why this rule applies to KBI. Do you have a copy of the rule with you by any chance?
I do. Either one, that's fine. Okay.
Okay, so if you look at Rule 1420B1,
Yes.
it says that this rule applies to any owner or operator of a lead melting facility or lead processing facility that processes lead-containing materials. Is it that second part of the applicability clause that applies to KBI?
That is correct. And then under C14 and lead, or excuse me, in C15, it talks about what a lead point source is and both also a lead processing facility. And in this case, lead processing facility is any primary or secondary lead smelter, foundry, lead acid battery manufacturer or recycler, lead plating or lead oxide, bronze or brass producer. And in this case, Kinsbursky is a lead acid battery recycler.
Okay. And because you are a lead processing facility under the definitions in the rule, is that what, well, I should say KBI is that what subjects this facility to the requirement to put in a total enclosure no matter how low its lead emissions are?
That is correct.
Okay. Are you aware as to whether this facility has a permit from DTSC?
I am aware, and yes, they do.
And do you know how much lead the DTSC permit allows the facility to process?
12 million pounds per month.
And do you know, that's per month, 12 million pounds per month?
Yes.
Okay. And how much does the facility actually process per month? Do you know?
Probably closer to 4 million. They're working one shift right now currently.
Okay. I have no further questions for this witness.
Thank you. Ms. Byrd, and then Mr. Balagopalan.
In one of the exhibits, and I can't remember which page, I think it's the last page of the photos. You said that you already have, or KBI already has on site all the equipment necessary to do the enclosure?
Not all of the equipment, but they've taken delivery of some of the large equipment as far as the filtration device itself and some of the air handling units.
So they have the control
Equipment.
on site already, not the total enclosure. Okay, I just wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. And then the results that you obtained from Almega, those have been discussed with the district?
They've been presented and provided to the district, yes.
Okay, and the district is in agreement with the processes and procedures used in accepting?
That's my
that as
understanding.
their fine- That's your understanding? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Armbruster, in the description, in the petition number 5, there's mention of using torches. And I'm not going to go by my memory, but where does the facility use the torch?
Okay, the torch hood is actually used, remember we showed the steel cases of the batteries, like that yellow, and I think it was picture number 2, or one of the pictures, but within that, in order to open up the battery to get to the cells in which the lead plates are located, they have to cut the steel outer casing. So they're using that cutting torch to actually open up the outside steel case.
What about those, and I forget the terminology, but the terminals that hold the plates together, do they cut those?
No, they do not.
They do not, okay. It's surprising, the only thing I remember about the facilities is how the floor looks like, the red color. But it's been 22 years. I had a question on the air monitoring. That is something you did, the facility did just to get an idea if it was a source of, if there's any issue with the.
That is correct. It was a proactive approach to this, again, being concerned with their operations and to make sure that there wasn't, they wanted to identify if there were any issues.
And it is still at the site, or has that been removed?
It's been removed. It was just a one-time event for that 7-day period.
I noticed you did it, the facility did it in the early part of the year. Is that when they, just after the holidays, what was the production rate at that time? Is it representative? What is normal
Yeah,
production?
it is representative of normal production. We were hoping to do that earlier, before the rule was even adopted, but again, it was just a matter of timing. But their production is very consistent throughout the year. There is no fluctuation really at this time. They're operating a single shift, and again, they're consistently in the same level of production. So we are very comfortable with the representativeness of the conditions at the time that sampling was conducted.
So while the lead emissions in the ambient air is below the national and the district standard, there's still currently emissions of lead into from the facility. Can you identify the sources where the lead has been emitted from?
Well, again, I'll be honest with you. When we look at the actual operation, because of the battery breaking, we talk about what a lead point source is, especially as defined in the rule.
Right.
The breaking area is the primary or the only lead point source at the facility, and it's a wet process. So we don't anticipate that there is any significant emissions from that process at all. Now, that's justified a little bit also with the industrial hygiene, the housekeeping that's conducted at the site. The only mechanism for lead to really be emitted if there were piles of lead dust and it were to dry out, and then that lead dust were to become disturbed somewhere and then entrained in the air through wind. They don't have that type of process there. Again, everything's a wet process. It's maintained wet. They're not heating the lead. There really isn't any mechanism. So as far as trying to truly identify an actual source of lead from the facility, I don't know that we can. We can only tell you that it's a suspected source of lead based on the fact that they are processing lead.
They have a wastewater treatment,
They do.
and that's the one identified. In Exhibit 5, is that the one in the south side at the extreme right?
So there is a filter press that's used as part of the removal of the lead oxide.
Jump to my next question. Yeah,
Right, from the
filter press.
sulfuric acid. So that is, again, where you see on the diagram within that battery breaking area, there is a filter press which would be on the south end of that battery breaking line. And the acid that is drained from the battery cells and the washdown water that is collected in that area gets directed to that filter press so they can actually remove the solid lead from that solution. And then the remaining material is directed to the filtrate is directed to the primary wastewater treatment system, which is located in the southern portion. I believe that's the one that you're referring to. And that is then discharged to the sanitary sewer system.
And is there any other filter press or here at this site?
Only within the main wastewater treatment system, and then the one with the lead itself.
When you
one
say,
handling
so
lead.
there is another filter press down there.
That's correct.
Is there any drying of the material, sludge?
It's only air dried within an enclosure.
Is there potential for that to be airborne when it gets dried?
The way they handle it, there'd be a very limited potential, if any, within that area. And at that point, they've removed the lead prior.
You're saying prior in the initial,
In the filter press that's associated with the battery breaking area.
and
Because that's their product. That's what they're trying to
right, but
obtain.
is that 100% removal there because there's no neutralization or anything? It's just the
I
the
can't,
press.
yeah, I don't know what the actual efficiency of the removal is, but lead is pretty easily removed. It's a non-soluble lead, most of it is at that point, so.
So what kind of housekeeping do you have right now?
Very, I would say, significant housekeeping efforts with sweepers, wet wash systems. I shouldn't say sweepers, but it's a wet sweeper, wet washing area. But well, it's actually just a wet wash driven with areas, and they're dedicated, and Paul can elaborate on this, but they have a very strict housekeeping program. And I think that if most people would be surprised to even think that this was a lead processing facility, because you do not see that type of operation typically look the way this. There's no sludge on the ground. There's no acid on the ground where people are walking through it. It's extremely very clean facility.
So the wash material then goes to also the treatment system on.
That would again go to that filter press associated with
press,
the battery breaking area.
So if there's
If there's lead within that
lead
solution, it
material,
would be
so
removed at that
will
point.
be removed at that point, and then it'll go to that treatment
Correct.
system, and it potentially could be. Since you said you handle the RCRA permits and so forth.
Yes.
Do they manifest those sludge before it's shipped?
Yes, they do.
That indicate any presence of lead in there?
You know, I don't know. I haven't looked at the waste analysis results recently, but typically it's less than 0.05% by weight.
Right. Okay.
And again, I should point out that the definition of a lead point source under Rule 1420 is those materials that have lead at a concentration greater than 0.05%.
Right. But you don't know what that concentration is in the sludge. that
Again,
you
historically, it's less than. It's less than 0.05% in what's being the filter cake that's being shipped off site.
How are they stored, the filter cakes? Is it left out in the open, or is it in drums? Or?
No, as a hazardous waste has to be maintained in a closed container unless you're actively adding or removing material from that container. So in this case, it's packaged in typically a cubic yard box and then sealed and closed within that, or into a roll-off possibly also.
What kind of control systems do you have currently? I know you're planning to put in the new unit. What do you have currently to control emissions, or or are there any
Sure.
systems?
So within the torch hood, again, which is only cutting steel at this case, but in this case, it's vented to a HEPA, a dust collection system with a HEPA and actually an ULPA filter on the end of it to filter out any particulate matter that may be generated during the cutting of the metal using the torch.
I'm sorry, can you repeat not just a HEPA, but a
Dust
it?
ULPA,
ULPA? What is that?
that's a ultra high.
Ultra
efficiency.
low
Yeah.
particulate arrestor.
Thank you.
Ultra lows, yes.
Ultra low.
And then also with the plastic grinding, once the plastic cases have been washed and they're ground, that material is collected for recycling, and that collection system and the grinders are also vented to a dust collection system currently equipped with HEPA filters.
And those will still be maintained?
Those will
Or
be
they removed?
those processes will be vented to the new air pollution control device.
Or to the new one, okay. Are those, the plastic material, is that classified as hazardous?
It's classified as a hazardous material. As a hazardous waste, but again, the waste analysis results, throughout the year, they periodically take samples of that material to characterize it. And again, we've identified it as not being a lead point source because the concentration of lead is less than 0.05% by weight.
And you said I think Ms. Feldman asked you, so you have both Part A and Part B permits from TTSC?
That's correct.
And you're permitted to, your petition actually said 20 million pounds. You said 12, so,
The permit is 12 million, there may be an error.
oh, I'm sorry, I misread it. It's 12, okay. My apologies. So what you're currently operating about, or the facility is operating about 4,000?
4 million.
4 million, 4 million, yes. So in your mitigation measure, you said you're limited to, what is your mitigation measure as part of the, to reduce emissions during the order if it's granted?
Within the variance conditions, you'll see what we're looking to do. At this point, we don't believe that really there aren't any excess emissions from this operation, so the need to mitigate in itself it's not warranted, it doesn't exist. But that said, they are going to do some additional things, including installing wet misters on that battery braking area to help ensure that there isn't any dust generated during the braking and opening of those cells.
Okay. No, because in your mitigation, in one of the responses to the question, you said you were limited to
Yes,
4 million.
and let me explain that. Because when we did the sampling, the ambient air monitoring, it was conducted based on that 4 million. And so that indicates that there isn't an issue. So we want to make sure that we don't create an issue. So we'll continue to operate. And instead of going up to that 12 million pounds per month that they could legally under DTSC's permit, they'll make sure that they maintain the operation at 4 million. So it's representative of what we saw during the ambient air monitoring.
And what is normal, I mean, what's the max they've gone, even though they've got a high permit limit? But what is it, 4 million is a month is typical?
I can't answer that, to be honest with you, but maybe Mr. Johnson can.
Okay, thank you for now.
I haven't had an opportunity to fully review the variance conditions, but is the limitation to current production levels reflected in the proposed variance conditions that you know of?
It is not. And again, that was based on our review with district staff when we went through it, because they did not see it as a risk, since there is no excess emissions from this operation.
Okay, so currently that is not a proposed,
No,
Okay.
it was in the petition, but
okay. I just had a couple of questions. First one is I just want to be clear as to when violations of the two rule conditions occur. The first one is for the total enclosure. That occurred already December 1st, 2018?
that's correct.
Okay, so the facility currently is in violation of the total enclosure G, whatever that is, of the rule,
G2B, yeah.
G2B.
Yes.
But the control devices, are they currently in violation, or that will be somewhere around January 25th?
January 25th, 2019.
2019. Okay, thank you. And I don't believe I heard it, but I do some reading and writing while testimony is going on. But have you testified as to the dates and efforts with the city of Anaheim, or is that the next
No, but.
That'll be the next
It
witness,
can be
Mr.
included in Mr. Johnson's testimony, or I can provide you some of that information.
Mr. Foster is indicating that the next witness will be providing that testimony? Yes. Okay, then I will hold the questions for that. Thank you, Mr. Armbruster. Anyone else have questions? Oh, Senator, and then,
Yeah, I think you're letting us know that lead, solid state, undisturbed. Therefore, I'm concerned about exhibit number 4. How are you able to establish as an ambient problem? There's enough ambient air to measure the lead content when the lead in a solid state has not been agitated in any way.
The ambient air monitoring that was conducted was at the fence line of the facility, so it's measuring the concentration of lead in the air around the property. So that's what
Not
you're looking
as a result of what's happening inside of the plant.
As a result of what's operating or happening within the plant, along the freeway, amongst other industrial sources in the area, it's the actual concentration of lead in that air around the plant.
And whatever the measurements are, they were not contributed to by this processing.
We believe if there's any contribution, it's minimal, if any. But again, there isn't any one direct mechanism that we know that lead is very heavy. So even if it was emitted at the point of operation, it would drop out quickly.
If it's minimal, what part of your operation it would contribute to any part of it at all?
Again, based on the district's Rule 1420 and the definition of a lead point source, that battery breaking table and the filter press within that area serving the acid that contains lead would be defined as lead point sources and therefore requiring control.
So some part of the acid becomes airborne. Sulfuric acid, some part of it was liquefied.
No, when I mentioned the acid part of it, it's because that acid is directed to a filter press, and that filter press removes the lead from the acid, and it's left with a filter cake. And when you remove that filter cake from the filter press, that is a potential source of lead emissions.
Okay, all right. Thank you.
Dr. Lerner has a question.
Just as a control issue, did you ever sample the ambient air around the building the way you did when the building was in operation? Did you do it when it wasn't in operation? For example, on a Saturday or Sunday when the building is not functioning? Just so you had an idea of what the difference is between the community and with and without functioning of the company.
Right. So the ambient air monitoring was conducted over a series of 7 days that encompassed an entire week. And is currently operating. The facility really isn't processing on Saturday or Sundays. So.
Then I can look at the data.
Yeah.
Mr. Amherst, I noticed that you did not ask relief from the source testing, which is FJ2, 1420J2, because the requirement is that you should conduct this initial source test, no later than 6 months after the permit to construct is issued. And do you not want to request relief from there because you'll be in violation of that?
No, in this case, the condition, the permit has been reissued with a modified condition.
Oh, it's been reissued?
Yes.
When was that?
Late last week, earlier this week.
And what is the, okay, and what's they set so then you extended by default
based on 6 days once the construction, 6 to 7 months after the construction has been completed.
Oh, okay. What was the date again on the new permit? We don't have a copy of that, do you? Okay. Did you, we'll wait and get the date. I was just wondering what the date was. So that's why you did not request the relief from J2?
Correct.
So 6 months, if it was issued last week, and we'll look at the timeframes, so you may not even, but you're still seeking relief from the first one, which is the, each point should be, within 6 months after construction, that each emission points should be controlled.
Correct.
And so we'll find out what the timeline, you know, when the permit is issued, 6 months, and when exactly, how long you're asking the relief, whether you need relief then from F1B or not, is my question.
F1B. That's what I want to see. Yeah, I think the condition as worded now in the permit is 6 months once the construction has been completed. But I understand the nuance here based on what
I'm sorry, the new condition you're talking about for source testing?
within the permit to
Thank you.
construct, yes. But I think the nuance is, again, the way the rule language is 6 months once the permit to construct is issued. So there's a conflict there. Is that what you're
Yeah,
identifying?
Right.
Yeah, I think that it's something we want to look at, and if it's appropriate, then maybe we modify the request for variance to include it if necessary.
Okay.
We'd like to make sure that we're not getting caught
Sure.
in the gap there. So we want to make sure the coverage is sufficient to allow construction to be completed and the source test within either the permit condition or a variance from the rule, or both.
And we can check in with the district once we have, and Ms. Byrd has a question.
I'm sorry, you probably answered part of this, but I was writing and I wanted to make sure I caught it. There are only two, what you consider to be potential sources of where lead could be a problem. That is the breaking area, and then when you're removing the filter cake. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else have any questions for Mr. Armbruster? Thank you. Mr. Armbruster, that was very clear and knowledgeable testimony, very much appreciated.
Thank you.
Mr. Foster, another witness.
Yes, call my next witness is Paul Johnson. Can you please state your name?
Yes, my name is Paul Damon Johnson.
And did you take the oath earlier this morning in preparation for testimony?
Yes.
Who is your current employer?
Kinsbursky Brothers Supply Incorporated.
And what is your job title at
am-
KBI?
I am the Director of Environmental Affairs.
How long have you been the Director of Environmental Affairs?
23 years.
And briefly describe your duties at KBI as Director of Environmental Affairs.
I'm responsible for overall compliance at the facility.
And I gave a fairly thumbnail sketch of KBI's operations at its facility in Anaheim. If you could briefly expand on that statement that I made, that'd be helpful for the board. Thank you.
So Kinsbursky Brothers is an environmental company specializing in the recycling of batteries, predominantly the large format industrial batteries. So we don't process small automotive style batteries. We specialize in the large format batteries. That's our niche. We handle all different types of battery chemistries, though we don't process all of them in our facility.
And if you could give a couple of examples, I think Bruce talked about some of the origins of these batteries, but if you could be a little more expansive on that as well.
Forklifts, electric vehicles, cranes, backup power systems for hospitals, telecommunications. Those are some of the large format lead acid battery sources.
Have you coordinated KBI's efforts to comply with the latest amendment to Rule 1420 that occurred in December of 2017?
Yes.
And can you briefly describe the steps that KBI took and is continuing to take in order to comply with the Rule 1420 requirements?
Yeah, so back in August of 2017, we started the process in expectation of the rule, and we contacted Bush, the company that manufactures the FEF unit, to describe what our operations were and determine what...
I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in and stop you. Can you give a lay person's description of the FEF unit? Thanks.
That would be the fugitive emissions filter. That's the APC device.
So that's essentially the emission control device that's part of the requirements of 1420.
Correct.
That is what takes the venting from the total enclosure.
Correct. So we started that process in August. We actually issued a quote, or a PO, I'm sorry, around December 12th for that, to purchase the equipment, which has to be manufactured. And that had a kind of a long lead time for that. We also hired Mr. Greg Grubb in February, who's a engineer to design the ducting and the layout of the APC equipment and the point source controls for the facility. And then eventually we hired Moreno Hughes to manage the construction project, and architects, engineers, all of those types of needs for a project of this size.
And can you describe the multiple agencies that were involved to whom you submitted permits for approval to construct this project, the total enclosure and the emission control device?
Well, including the DTSC, who we contacted, notified for a permit modification, kind of let them know what we were doing. And we also contacted the city and had meetings with the city to find out if there was a process to expedite this, because we recognized that the rule had a short time frame in it. And met with a myriad of architects, engineers, all of those different type of individuals in order to, scope the project very thoroughly. It is a very complex process.
I'm sorry, as you're going through the efforts that were made, if you could give us dates or timeline, that would also be helpful.
So I said the PO to purchase the APC equipment was issued in December of last year. We hired the air specialist engineer, or Mr. Grubb, who's he actually wrote part of the industrial hygiene manual. He's a professor at Michigan, I believe, Michigan State. And then in March, we were actually issued the permit to construct to the SCAQMD when we first had our first layout of what the process was going to look like and what the building was going to look like. I think those are key milestones.
In particular, I'm sorry, you mentioned meetings with the city regarding the process to expedite or DTSC. If you can give us those timeframes, that would be helpful too.
In April 30th, 2018, we met with the DTSC, and then where's the one for the city? It was actually in December that after we issued the PO, that we first started the construction and ventilation equipment conference calls with all of the different parties to start working on this.
And can you give the names of the departments of the city of Anaheim with whom you needed to deal for permit submission?
It's the building department. We had a lot of discussions with the fire department specifically because of fire code issues with an enclosure and sprinkler systems, and then there's plumbing, electrical, a lot of different code issues that had to go along to it that we hadn't initially considered when we were designing just the building enclosure and looking just at the construction parts of that.
And are the building department and the fire department separate entities in the city with whom you dealt?
I think so, the planning department as well.
Okay, so you've got 3 departments within the city of Anaheim with whom we're in communication in order to submit permits that were required to construct the equipment and get in compliance with 1420.
Correct.
And I believe you said that you checked with the city of Anaheim to determine if there were any methods to expedite permit review by any of those 3 agencies that you were dealing with, and what was the result of those communications?
Well, though for typical construction for a home or something, there is a mechanism to do that. They felt that with a project this complex with this many moving parts, that was not a possibility.
And then on your side, on the KBI side, you were dealing with both architectural designers as well as engineers to create this. And we're talking about a project that was really an integration of the total enclosure which is one aspect of 1420 compliance, and the emission control device to which the total enclosure is going to be vented, correct?
Correct, and we've actually had weekly meetings that go all the way back, I believe, to January. And every single one of these meetings, every single week, we have engineers, architects, and all of the different electricians and members that are in those meetings.
I'm going to give some more exhibits to the board.
Okay, we've received a one-page document, Kinsbursky Design and Construction. It looks like a timeline, and we'll mark that timeline as Exhibit 5. 6? I'm
Six.
sorry.
So,
Exhibit
so
6.
for shorthand, that can be the Hughes Marino schedule.
Oh, thank you, the Hughes Marino schedule, thank you. And then we have a multiple-page document, which is still being passed out to the board. And this is another timeline, and,
If you look up in the upper right-hand corner, it's got the name Gray,
Gray.
G-R-A-Y. Call
Thank
that the Gray timeline.
thank you, and we'll call that the gray timeline, and that will be Exhibit 7.
Mr. Johnson, do you have exhibits 6 and 7, the Hughes Marino and the Gray timelines in front of you?
Correct, yes.
And can you generally describe what is depicted on these two exhibits and the purpose for their preparation and how they're used?
So the Hughes Marino is kind of a higher level schedule of the large milestones without such detail as the Gray schedule. The Gray schedule includes all of the very detailed tasks and aspect of this project and all of the different disciplines that are required to be taking place throughout the schedule of the project.
And Hughes Marino is a third-party construction management firm, is that correct?
Correct.
And approximately when was Hughes Marino brought on board to participate in this project?
I want to say in December we first talked with them.
And again, when you say December 2017?
Correct.
Yes.
Beginning meetings with contractors and architectures was 12/18/2017.
Okay. And is there anything that could assist the board in understanding the complexity and interaction of the three agencies, as well as architects and designs, on either of these exhibits that you could point out as an example?
Well, because of the nature of the project, we have to do things in a certain order. There's certain aspects of this that will require KBI members to remove equipment, and then there will be certain construction disciplines that will come in and put in footings, and then they have to get out of the way for the next guys to come in on board and do this. And we all have to do this while we're trying to maintain the current structure that is there and all of the current electrical and plumbing and everything that's in that. So it's a very difficult task. It's not just like building a brand new piece of, or a building or a house.
And it's certainly not like putting a tool shed in your backyard.
Correct. A little more difficult than that.
Can you take a look at exhibits, the schedule, the timeline exhibits, and tell me when the projected completion date is for the project?
I believe that we are looking at a final completion. A conservative estimation is going to be July of this year, or next year, I'm sorry, 2019.
And in connection with the petition for variance and various operating conditions, did you consider curtailing any of the operations at KBI's facility?
We feel that if we can curtail our business, it's going to be very devastating to us from a financial standpoint. So we're trying not to do that, though we will have to at times not operate.
And did you have a projection for the immediate economic loss that would occur with curtailment, shutting down this this operation?
We estimate that we would lose $25 million during the period of the construction.
And what about the potential for employee layoffs?
That's the largest employee department that I have at the facility, and so I would definitely lose some employees in there.
And then what about any projected, oh, I'm sorry, do you
Probably
have-
about 25 employees, I think.
Okay, and what about projected future economic losses from an inability to provide current customers with this battery breaking operation?
Kinsbursky Brothers worked for 30 years to build up the customers that we have that have a unique need for the special kinds of batteries that we process. And we feel like if once they find another home, it's hard to get them back, and we're worried about being able to maintain our customer base.
And do you have a ballpark estimate of what that loss could be?
It could be $100 million. It would be devastating to our business.
Has the district issued KBI any notices of violation or notices to comply within the last 2 years?
No.
Have you had any complaints from neighbors or the public with respect to any aspect of your operations within the last
never.
2 years? Okay. And what is your best estimate of the total project cost that will be involved in the total enclosure and the emission control device in order to be compliant with Rule 1420?
Currently between $4 and $4.4 million.
No further questions.
Ms. Feldman, questions?
Yes, thank you. We've heard some testimony which at least indicated that KBI got a modified permit to construct from the SCAQMD last week. Do you know exactly when you got that permit?
When we got the initial permit,
No, the
the
modified
modified
permit.
version, I believe last Thursday or Friday.
Okay, so 6 months from that date would get us into June of next year,
Correct.
right? Okay. In your variance petition, you had originally identified, I think, June 1st as your final compliance date. Is that right?
Initially, yes.
Yes, and so it's according to Exhibit 6, the Hughes Marino schedule, that seems to have slipped about 6 weeks.
A little bit, yes.
What happened?
This is a very complex project, and there's been lots of little things found along the way that are going to take a little longer to get. Some of the equipment pieces, some of the disciplines, and scheduling is just very complex.
Right. So the petition would have indicated that you could have done a source test within 6 months of issuance of the modified permit, but based on this new schedule, I would suggest that maybe during the recess, you consider whether you also need a variance from the F1B requirement to do the source test within 6 months. When did KBI apply for permits from Anaheim?
I think the first conversations we had, we said were, I think I get that date earlier. We started the conversations early in the year, and I think they've given partial plan meetings with them, but the final plan is going to be submitted next week, I believe, for the building department.
Okay, so
That's on the schedule, on one of these schedules.
It is, and that's one of the things that I found just a little confusing about the Hughes Marino schedule. If you look at that, Exhibit 6, and it says, item 6 on that, documents ready for permit and bid,
Yes.
is that the Anaheim permit?
No, that's for the bid packages that will go to the different disciplines. So there will be several electricians, several different construction groups that will be issued a bid package so that they can give us the quotes on those aspects of it. It's all kind of,
I see.
related. The final drawings will also be at that time.
Okay, so does this schedule have anything on it that relates to the the submission of final documents required by Anaheim?
I believe that item 5, when the final review is done, that is the date that they are going to submit those. Like I said, I think that's next week.
Okay. Is that the first set of documents that was ever submitted to Anaheim?
I believe that the architect has sat with Anaheim and done that, but I don't know if they've done a formal submittal because of the changes. They have some discussions, they come back and say, well, this has to be this kind of occupancy.
May I?
It's up to the chair if you want to take a witness out of order.
If you can, for this, for a limited purpose, and please just identify who is speaking for the record.
Bruce Armbruster, for the record. There have been multiple meetings with the city of Anaheim regarding the entire plan check and permit review process. And within that, we had talked about a segmented submittal to the city as we were going through the engineering and design process for this project. And the city had opted not to do it with a segmented. They want everything at one time. And so that's why the submittal's been delayed, because there was engineering that was still going on regarding the overall construction of the building, and the city didn't want to look at it in pieces. They wanted to look at it in its entirety.
Okay, I understand.
Thank you.
Did the city give you any indication of how long it would take them to issue a permit once they have the final submittal?
I believe that we're told 6 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks is what the estimated architect says.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, by this time, that plan will be completely filled out, so we don't anticipate a lot of comments at this point.
Okay, so I see. So that's the point in delaying submission of the
Correct.
final package, was to work out any problems.
Correct.
As you go along the way.
Yes.
Okay, so hopefully what the city gets will be essentially perfect.
We hope so, yes.
I don't have any further questions.
I would like, I would like to understand a little bit more I'm trying to get my arms around the beyond reasonable control. And so I'm trying to understand, I guess I don't understand the process between KBI and the city. If there has been no submittal, I know there's been communications, but so where is the delay? Is the delay, it doesn't sound like the city's been sitting with it. It sounds like it's been on KBI. So if you can explain that better.
For instance, one of the things that we encountered when we started this out was they looked at the whole building as an H occupancy, which was going to be a cinder block wall around the entire portion of this. And so working with the fire department and then defining the fire code, how it applied to that building, the whole scope of work changed, and we limited a certain portion of it to an H occupancy, and that changed the entire construction materials of the building, which then changed all of the engineering calculations. And so those are the kind of conversations these multiple meetings with the city have drug up or brought up. So we've changed the scope of that throughout that process, which required redrawing the drawings and everything.
And how far into the process did, for example, the one change you just mentioned in
That was a
detail?
big one. That was one of the biggest ones. And so that delayed it for all the architects to re-engineer the building and redraw the drawings, was significant.
And approximately when was that?
Do you have a date on here?
Approximately.
I'm going to say February, March was when probably that part of that was discovered.
And that delayed to the point where we are now, where we don't even have final drawings, or?
In July was when that part of the process changed drastically.
Can you explain that one?
Well, that was from the H occupancy. So we discovered that in February. It took us that much longer to come up with an alternative to those.
Okay, so from February, March to July, you knew about it's called age occupancy?
Yes.
Okay. And it took that long to redesign?
Redesign the building to
Can
be
you-
able to support the APC equipment, the ducting and all that. That's a lot of engineering that's going into that.
If I may clarify?
Yes, Mr. Armbruster, and also if you can explain, So the rule allows 6 months after July. All of this occurred before July, July meaning because that's when the permit to construct was issued from the district. So I'm trying to understand where the hangup
Sure.
is more than what is anticipated in the rule.
To clarify, so after the initial meetings with the city and with the fire department, it was determined that the occupancy would be an H occupancy. So at that point, the design from February moving forward was based on the development of plans and engineering associated with fulfilling the requirements for an H occupancy. And then in July of 2018, it was discovered there was some alternatives that the occupancy, based on further review by the city, would change to what they call a standard F1S1, which is a manufacturing operation. In doing so, that changed the design specifications for the building again, and that's when everything was restarted, and that brings us to the current point where we're waiting to finalize it. But it basically shifted the whole paradigm under which the engineering was being completed, as it has commenced in February of 2018 under the H occupancy requirements. Come July, a new set of standards were applied to the facility that resulted in the change and having them to go back to the drawing board, literally.
Who is in these meetings? I just want to know, between Mr. Armbruster, who's kind of jumping in, and Mr. Johnson, who's been in the meetings and with the firsthand knowledge? I just want to understand.
Yeah, I've been meeting personally with the fire department and the architects and the project manager at Kinsbursky, Dan Gillespie. We've been having those meetings with the city.
Okay, so perhaps, are you the better witness to answer the questions with regard to timeline and the reasons why everything changed?
Perhaps.
Okay. Okay, and then, so you are anticipating that it'll be, okay, so the final design, what's the date on that final design? There's a, what is that, number 5 on here?
21st, I believe. Documents for routine.
Right, so there's a window, is that right? The window is, and it would be on December 21st would be a submittal?
21st was the last date that I heard this week, yes.
Okay, and you're still on track for that?
Yes.
Okay. And then why do you need more than the 6 months? That's, even if we started the clock now and I mean, when we originally looked at this petition, you were asking for June, and 6 months from the date, if it's 6 months from now, so then the clock would start. It seems like there was a delay that brought you to this point, and then a further delay, which is going to go beyond the 6 months. So even from today. So I'm just trying to understand, is it that much more complicated now moving forward, even once the final designs are put in place?
Yeah.
And if you could just, identify for the recording who is speaking.
Bruce Armbruster, for the record. So in this case, I think Paul has alluded to the fact that there are a lot of moving pieces, and part of that is the engineering. And every time a simple component changes within engineering, if they change the material of construction for the wall, then what happens is then that goes back and gets routed through all the engineering for the mechanical, the electrical, plumbing, and they look at it from the weights of the ductwork. In this case, we have a building. It's not a standard building. It's within this. They're looking at things that they have to take care of because there's an existing structure. We mentioned earlier there's a canopy over this, and within that canopy there's solar panels on top of it. They cannot use that existing canopy to support any of this new structure. And so every time there's a change made, they have to go back through the calculations, they look at the footings, and it's a whole process. Now that in itself has created the delays in the engineering and design of this. But within that, now moving forward, once approved by the city and they can break ground, then there's going to be the process itself of just timing and sequencing the construction to allow them to hopefully continue to operate and make money so they can exist as a business while still accomplishing the task at hand as far as putting in the structure and completing the ventilation of these point sources. That in itself is problematic because we're also operating under a permit from DTSC, and the site has to be maintained in a particular area to minimize the potential for negative impacts to the environment as far as releases. And so we're talking about changes to secondary containment systems within those operations. So again, there's a lot of different moving parts that have to be coordinated, and at times, at many of these times, it's beyond what Kinsbursky controls. It's in the hands of the regulators and the engineers that are actually creating the design and the requirements.
Okay. Okay. KBI is definitely, one entity, and its engineers, its consultants are all it for purposes of beyond reasonable control, but I understand a little better. Mr. Balagopalan, you had questions?
Yeah, in the timeline on exhibit number 6, and the item number 7, the plan review, that's a city plan review timeline?
I believe so.
About 8.4 weeks you're giving for the city.
Yes.
Do you anticipate any kind of delay? Or is that built into that 8.4 weeks?
We built it into this schedule because we feel like the plans will be complete at this time because of all those changes that we've made throughout the process.
So it's factored into that 8?
That's factored in there with plan review and some questions that'll come back, comments, time for us to answer those comments and resubmit. That's built into the schedule.
And similarly, on item 12, you built in some factor for construction delays?
Yes.
And so the 21.4 is on the high-end estimate.
Yes,
So it's potentially you could finish earlier, but you...
potentially.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Ms. Byrd?
I just have a slight bit of confusion. The new requirements that change from H occupancy to F1, S1 occupancy, was that based on talking to different departments with the city, or why was that changed?
Yeah, it was a combination of meetings, again, with the fire department and building department.
And they had different feelings about what should happen, the two different departments within the same city?
That's correct.
Okay, so you had already met with one who said you could do this a certain way, and then when you met up with another department, they said no.
Yes, and I should say maybe this, as the property itself, as it's been regulated over the years by the city of Anaheim, they discovered that maybe they hadn't been regulating it properly over time. And so this was their opportunity to correct that.
Okay. Okay, I can follow that. I've had that experience personally. Okay.
Was it any time under the city of Fullerton?
No. No,
No, it was always city of Anaheim?
that's correct. It's the gateway of Anaheim.
Gateway Anaheim.
With whom we're very appreciative that they were able to make that determination.
Now,
Wait, one second. Ms. Byrd, did you have additional questions? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Balagopalan.
you didn't factor in, is there any other pending review with DTSC in here, approval that you need, and is that factored in here? And if so, can you let me know where it is?
Yeah, we've worked closely with DTSC, and we are comfortable with the timelines within this framework we've created within this, that they'll be able to accept and make any modifications. This is what we would consider at this point a Class 1 asterisk type permit modification under the California Code of Regulations. And within that, the way it's structured now, it's a notification and a publication type process without any real, we don't need formal approval prior to getting that permit modification based on the way it's currently configured.
And at what point in time or would you be doing that to DTSC?
At this point, based on our conversation with DTSC, they only need schedule updates, and once the construction is completed, then we will have 30 days to complete a notification process. So that it won't hold up the process at all.
Okay, thank you.
Senator?
It'd have been simple and straightforward if you'd just given a report on the hangups that you were receiving in Anaheim and the time delay that they would cause you for not meeting the schedule. Just bang, bang, A, B, C, and get it done with. And then, as you did the in-house operation, it was clearly understood at that point in time.
I'm not sure if I truly understand.
If you had given an in-depth discussion of the problems that was associated with getting permits from Anaheim, fire department, et cetera. Then, of course, we're gonna move a lot faster. Anything else that you think that should be answered in order to complete that discussion as relates to the local government approval, what you're requiring?
I don't believe so. We've had meetings, we've talked about potential changes in parking requirements, you know, and the restrictions. We've gone through all those different elements that could be triggered as a result of these proposed tenant improvements, and I think those have all been identified, and the intent is now that the plan set that will be going to the city will be comprehensive and addressed each one of those. So we've worked out all the kinks ahead of time.
Good, done.
Any other questions for either Mr. Johnson or Mr. Armbruster? Okay, then why don't we take a break? Let's take a break until a little more than 15 minutes, and we'll reconvene at 10:50. We're off the record. Yes, and we're off the record. We are back on the record. And Mr. Foster, I believe you are done with your affirmative case?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Feldman, do you have a witness?
Well, Mr. Foster is done with his affirmative case, except that he's going to request.
Oh, okay. He has a request.
If you take a look at the variance petition itself, in number 9, it says list all district rules and/or permit conditions, et cetera, to which the variance would apply. We need to add an additional subsection of Rule 1420, which is 1420J2, and that requires that a source test for the new emission control equipment be conducted no later than 6 months after a permit to construct is issued for that equipment. So the permit that was recently modified, giving additional time for that source test, is inconsistent with the time limits as set forth in 1420. So we would request that variance also cover that time period and be phrased that the petitioner be granted 45 days from completion of the construction of the emission control device in order to conduct a source test on that device.
One moment. Okay. So is that something that we would put in the conditions, that the source test will be completed within 45 days of construction? I'm trying to understand how that.
Yes, we could do that, but again, because the permit as recently reissued is inconsistent with the time limits set forth in 1420, you can't conduct a source test before the equipment itself is in place and operating. So
Okay, but what we cannot do, what we can do is give you a variance from a rule condition requiring, but we can't give you a variance and change it, but we could put a condition in that says within 45 days of construction, because I'm trying to understand what.
Okay, can I
Yes,
clarify a little bit?
please, Ms. Bell. And also, can you clarify the difference between that and you now have a new permit which says 6 months? You won't be in compliance with that either. Is that?
Okay,
Do you
wait.
need? Okay, please.
I apologize for the confusion, but the permit, the new modified permit has not actually yet been issued. It's been shared with the facility as of last week, Thursday, I believe, so that they could take a look at it prior to issuance. We anticipate issuing the permit next week. The permit will be consistent with all rule requirements. The inconsistency to which Mr. Foster is alluding is that there is a requirement in the rule that states that a source test needs to be conducted no later than 12 months after the new structure is completed. And that is inconsistent with another rule provision, J2, which says that you have to do a source test within 6 months of a permit being issued.
I'm sorry, the 12 months after new structure, that comes from where?
Okay. If you take a look at G2B, it says,
That's the December 1st, 2018.
yeah, no later than 12 months after December 1st, 2017, if the owner or operator is constructing a new structure. Oh, that's for the total
That's
enclosure.
for the total enclosure.
I'm
yeah.
sorry,
And then
I'm sorry. So,
Lots of confusion.
wait a minute, I have to find it.
Good time to nail it down.
Go to J2.
J2.
Yeah, but this is not, this is specific to completion of the structure.
F1B.
Right, that's right. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just stating it badly. They can't complete the structure without a permit to construct. They can't even start the structure without a permit to construct. The rule gives them 12 months, the way it's written, to complete the enclosure. But then it turns around and requires that a source test be done within 6 months of issuance of the permit in J2. So theoretically,
Are you talking about the control system? Because the total enclosure is based on a year period.
Yeah.
It's- Okay, so you're talking about the control equipment.
yes.
Okay.
So it's a little confusing because you have 12 months to complete the structure and only 6 months to do a source test on the equipment within that structure. So the rule has an internal inconsistency, the way we're reading it.
The date is a certain date. It's not 12 months, right? It's 12 months from
It
December
has to
1st,
be, it's,
2017, which means December 1st, 2018,
right.
For the total enclosure.
for the total
For the total
enclosure.
enclosure.
Okay, and
But
that
if you
will not
look
be
at
met.
J2,
Was not met.
it says they have to conduct a source test within 6 months
Of the issuance of the permit to
of the
construct.
issuance of the permit to construct.
Now, can a permit to construct be modified and reissued? And that be the trigger date rather than the initial issuance date? Because if the permit to construct can be modified and extended, if it can't, if the only trigger date is the initial
No, we-
issuance of the permit to construct, then we do need relief from J2 because we're not going to
Well, the
have
initial permit to construct in this case was issued in March.
July.
Oh, July, I'm
July
sorry.
20.
So it hardly matters in this case whether we're using the modified permit or the original permit as the trigger date, because you're going to miss it either way.
Let's see, let's see, December, January, March, April, May, June. Correct.
It seems there's an inconsistency.
So
So
it
there's
seems
no,
like there's an
there's no harm
inconsistency.
to putting J2 in.
Right.
The question is, do you also, once this permit is, well, the permit doesn't exist yet, so I don't know if we can give a variance from it, but that is going to say 6 months, and it won't be 6 months.
Can't the permit say consistent with the variance that was?
We have no control over what the
Yeah,
permit says.
The permit wouldn't incorporate the variance, but
The permit could reference compliance with Rule 1420, J2, and then we get relief from J2.
yeah. Yes.
Okay, and then I think we'd want to see in the conditions, a 45-day, a
45
condition
days
of
from
45 days from the
Completion of
completion of
construction.
construction.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Okay. And again, I apologize for the confusion. Obviously, this was confusing even to us. Had we caught it prior to the hearing, I would not have been so incoherent.
No, it was fine, and obviously took a while for us all to understand.
The district does have the permitting engineer here in the event that you have questions, but I honestly believe that you've heard everything you need to about the status of the permit and certainly the compliance schedule. But if you do have any remaining questions for the engineer, we can present him.
Okay, Mr. Balagopalan does.
Well, of course, Mr. Balagapalan does. One engineer to another. Okay, the district will call then Atul Kandari. Could you please state your name and spell it for the record?
Atul Kandari, ATULKANDHARI.
Did you take the oath this morning?
Yes.
And what is your position with the district?
I'm a permitting engineer in operations team.
As part of your duties here at the district, are you familiar with KBI and its pending permit application?
Yes.
I will defer to the hearing board for questions.
Thank you. Mr. Kandari, I had a question on the, what specifically has been modified in the revision to the permit to construct that was issued in July 25th, 2018?
I can actually present you an exhibit if you want, or I can explain. What they were doing, they were including certain areas like the battery breaking line, and then there was potential about the filter press, and they were also considering a gel battery line. So these new sources will be vented to the baghouse. Currently, they are only venting the granulators.
The permit that was issued said 20 pickup points. So this additional pickup points, or does it include the initial 20 pickup points? Because in the, if you look at the control equipment permit, application 602162, it says up to 20 suction hoods. So the new changes includes that 20, or is it additional suction hoods that have been added to pick up those points that you just mentioned?
They're adding additional suction hoods.
So the revised permit will have additional suction hoods.
Yes.
Are the suction hoods been described, so in the new permit, are you going to, is there the description that they have to vent it to the control specific areas?
Yes, it's in the basic permit. It will be in 602161.
The revision to that? So that will identify those areas that needs to be vented to the control system?
Yes, we already did when we issued the PC 602161. We identified
I don't see that. Can you tell me where? Maybe I missed it.
in the equipment description, filter press and lead oxide cake removal station.
Yeah, it describes the process. It doesn't describe that the fact that this, been vented to the control system. So, and nowhere does it say that, individually. And I'm okay if the revision is going to correct the deficiency.
Okay.
And list specifically the, at least the major pickup points, so that an inspector, when he goes there, knows that there was design and there's some areas that have been identified as potential source and has been, should be, vented to the control system.
Okay.
And is the intention to modify the permit to reflect that?
When we were going to issue the PO, we were going to make few other changes. There were some minor changes which they happened after the PC was issued, but we can change that.
Okay, I'm a little confused. Are you going to reissue the permit to construct, or are you going to issue a permit to operate already?
The permit to construct, only reason there were discussions happening to reissue because of the inconsistency in the rule. But we haven't sent that yet. But when we issued the PO, there were few things which were pointing out to me, like the horsepower rating of the blower. Instead of 250, it will be 300. So those things we were going to take care at the time of issuance of PO.
Shouldn't you do it when you have the opportunity when you're revising the permit to construct? Should you not do it then?
Yeah, now since we are going to, if we're changing the language, yes, we can do it now.
Okay. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Kandari? Senator Dunn.
I appreciate the chair for the clarification. When you clarify what the timelines were, I was going to raise that question, but you did.
Yes,
Sorry.
Ms. Balagopalan.
Currently, is there a production limit in any of the permits on how many batteries they can process in a month? Or how many pounds of lead?
Not on the batteries, not in our permits. Our permits only have limits on the pounds of plastic which can be shredded, granulated in the shredders.
Okay, so there is no limit on that. Now, I'm going to go to the couple of the variance condition, if I can go through that right now. Variance condition, which is exhibit number 1. So this requires testing of the existing air pollution control device that are listed in those 2 permits reference. So, and the purpose of that is?
That was actually put in at the request of compliance to ensure that, during the construction time, there is no discontinuity. They continue to vent these existing sources to the baghouse.
Okay. And then, smoke test, let's see what that is. Okay, actually, that's it. Thank you.
And number 6 was new. That was actually something which was not done before.
Oh,
That-
yes, that's, thank you. So that's my other question, which I completely slipped. So that's a misting system. Is that going to be a temporary?
Yes.
So so it is a temporary system until the new enclosure and control system is in place?
Yes.
Okay. And then when it says maintain daily, okay, number 3, daily production records for each process in the battery dismantling. What is, besides, this is including the batteries then? It's not just plastics then, right?
They have internal record how many batteries they are breaking, and also for our purposes, we wanted the number of pounds which will be granulated in the grinders.
So it will include, this requirement will include both the plastic material that is
Shredded.
granulated and also the battery. Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other questions for Mr. Kandari? Thank you, Mr. Kandari. No other witnesses, Ms. Feldman?
No, thank you.
Okay, is there any member of the public who wishes to be heard today? And I see none. Mr. Foster, you're closing, and I don't think there's an actual date in July by which we heard that you'd like the variance to go through, so if you can include that in your closing, please.
I think that the requested date is August 30th, based on the current schedule, the current construction schedule.
That includes the extra time to do the source test.
Okay. I wanted to know date of construction because we are going to have to add a new condition with regard to construction so we can have the variance last longer, so I just need that date as well.
According to Exhibit 6, it's September, it's
It's
July
the
10th.
10th, right? I just want to
Yes.
make sure that that's the date and,
Right, so if we could have 10 days from that date, so July 20th.
okay, go ahead, and I'll calculate the rest out. You may give your closing. Oh. We were looking for a date I was looking for a date when the variance would end, what they're requesting, but we would add on for the source test. So the 10th, the July 10th is what is identified on Exhibit 6 as the date they anticipate now for the end of construction. So they were adding another 10 days for the completion of construction, just as a cushion, and then 45 days after that. When you're ready, Mr. Foster.
Thank you. I think the overarching lens through which this variance petition needs to be viewed is the fact that, as we currently sit here today, the operations at KBI's facility, as measured by the air monitoring report, show an order of magnitude below the allowable limits for the emissions that are controlled by 1420, that is lead. So we're talking about an additional layer of protection that will be in place. But again, as we sit here today, the emissions from the facility are and will be in compliance for many, many years as the rule is currently written. If I could just quickly tick through the 6 findings that are required from Health and Safety Code 42352. KBI is currently in violation for the total enclosure requirement of 1420, and according to current schedules will be for the emission control device. The conditions that led to the violation and the prospective violation were beyond the control of KBI, as you've heard, with the multiple city agencies required to review and approve permits, and in fact, a major shift within the two of the city departments from the H occupancy to the F1, S1 occupancy, necessitating major revisions and changes to the design and engineering of the total enclosure and the emission control device. I believe that closing the KBI facility would be without any corresponding benefit in reducing air contaminants. Again, as we sit here today, without that equipment in place, you have lead emissions an order of magnitude below what is the allowed limit under 1420. Curtailment was considered, but curtailment would result in irreparable harm to the facility with loss of immediate customers, loss of future customers, and employee layoffs. Emissions, how will excess emissions be reduced is not necessarily relevant here because, again, we're not dealing with a situation where excess emissions exist. Again, please keep the focus on the fact that the lead emissions from Kinsbursky's facility, not a smelter, not a melter, breaking up batteries and recycling them is an order of magnitude below allowable limits. And finally, will KBI monitor and quantify emissions during the variance period? And the answer is yes, if you look at their normal permit conditions as well as the variance conditions that we have agreed to and discussed and talked about with the district staff. So I think that it's fully within the hearing board's ability, and all the testimony and exhibits have demonstrated that all 6 findings can be made, and it is appropriate to issue a regular variance pursuant to KBI's petition. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Feldman, your closing.
Yes, thank you. The district concurs with the closing made by Mr. Foster and believes that the hearing board does have sufficient evidence upon which to base the 6 findings. So the district will not oppose the granting of a regular variance here today, subject to the conditions set forth in Exhibit 1 as modified. And I'd like to offer up my modifications and hope that they're consistent with the hearing board's new understanding. I would also draw your attention once again to condition number 6, which does act as a mitigation measure for any emissions. There are no excess emissions, but any emissions during the course of the variance will be further mitigated by the misting system that will be in use temporarily. The district would suggest that after condition number 6, a new condition number 7 be added that states that petitioner shall complete construction of the total enclosure consistent with requirements set forth in Rule 1420G no later than July 20th, 2019.
Should we include not just the total enclosure, but also the associated control device?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. The existing 7 would become 8. There would be a new condition 9. That states that petitioner shall conduct a source test. Within 45 days of completion of construction of the total enclosure.
An associated control device.
And then, other than changing the numbers of the succeeding variance conditions, there would be no other revisions offered by the district. That completes my closing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Feldman. I feel like you read my mind.
Can I just for clarification purposes, so that leaves us with a new 11 variance conditions, is that correct?
Yes, although when a motion is made, if all other fees have been paid, since there are no excess emissions, we may delete the one with regard to the payment of fees.
Well, you may want to leave that just because I've never received the bill for the publication fee.
Okay.
So
That's
Oh.
different than the 303.
Oh,
Okay.
okay, I thought they were all within that same thing. Okay, then
Okay.
that's fine. Deletion would be acceptable.
I always defer to the members of the clerk's office. They are more knowledgeable than me. Okay, no further statements. Okay, board members. Anyone wish to begin the discussion? If not, I'll happily. Mr. Balgoblan, please.
No, I think the petitioner was proactive, knowing, worked with the district, knowing that the rule was coming, and initiated discussion with the control system manufacturer and the design and for the ducting, and is spending a substantial amount of money, close to $4.4 million to come into compliance with the rule, and unfortunate delays, and which is kind of expected when you're trying to go through the cities and different agencies to get the permit. We've seen that before. So I think, I think we can easily make the sixth finding. They are already in violation of F1, I believe, and they will be in violation of the other two sections.
I think it's the opposite.
F1.
G2B, I think they're already in.
G2B, they're in violation of, sorry. And then they will be in violation of F1B and J2 based on the date. And I would actually go with the initial permit to construct issue date, and so that companies don't game the system by making some modification to the permit and get a different timeline. So unless it was a substantial change with the whole control system, then that's a total different approach. So I think we can make the first finding. The second finding, I think they took all reasonable measures to come into compliance within compliance, but is beyond the reasonable control that they, and not getting the variance will be unreasonable taking of the property and closing practical, maybe, or closing of the business. So, and I think we've heard evidence that they proactively did ambient air monitoring, but so I think we can feel, even though we don't have the production data, I know exactly what they were doing at that time when they took the data, but we had testimony that there was normal production. So the ambient air monitoring data showed that they are below the standards. Even though they're below the standard, I still want to point out that they actually led emissions and other metals too. And with the installation of the new control system, hopefully those all will be reduced substantially, even further than what they are doing right now. So I think that'll be a benefit of the control system. So, I think, and number 5, the fact that they're adding the misting system temporarily to control emissions from the where they break up the batteries. I think it's will help to keep the emissions down, and they will looks like there's no excess emissions. So, but they have conditions in the permit. They have to do some testing and every 7 days and keep a record, so that'll ensure that they keep that they will monitor and quantify emissions to some extent. And they're not going to quantify emissions, but they'll be doing the smoke test during the periods, which I think is appropriate. So I think they meet all the conditions for granting a variance.
Very well stated. Ms. Bird, you had more to add?
I just wanted to say I agree. And when I first picked this up to review it, and Ms. Feldman addressed that issue, of course it said, "Oh no, a lead recycler. Oh no," and but as I read it, I was reminded of when I was in many years ago. When I was in school. And my first day in environmental toxicology, and the first page says, "It's the dose that makes the poison." And that's what that's where my brain went after I read it. It's like, oh, that's right. This won't be an issue because it's clear that the testing has been done and it is below. Not only is it low, they will be in compliance years from now based on 1420, even if they had not changed anything. So I think this is a case where we can definitely make the findings and have a level of comfort, at least knowing that the emissions levels will be low.
I agree too, and I think rightfully so, as we were all saying, we first read the petition and said, oh my gosh, another lead facility. The entire presentation at first was really focused on, well, there's really no excess emissions. And I think that was good, but at first I didn't see enough facts with regard to due to beyond reasonable control, conditions beyond reasonable control. But I do think that ultimately we did hear that the city was using this as an opportunity to really change up its regulation of this facility, and things were changed multiple times by multiple departments. And I think it makes sense. As it's been stated, I know that Mr. Balagopalan stated, we have seen this before with cities, so I think it's clearly beyond reasonable control. And the moving forward, I am concerned about it's a longer period of time than would otherwise be allowed underneath, but I do believe it is a complicated system, but more importantly, the idea that there are no excess emissions, and it's a very low lead emitting facility. And I just wanted to add, I don't know if you talked about the curtailment, just making sure that we cover that finding, but the only curtailment in lieu of obtaining a variance would be to shut down, so that's not feasible. And of course, the reduction of excess emissions will be accomplished by the whole idea is that we're only talking about particulates. That's what we're talking about. And so the misting system will really be helpful towards making sure that that there's no emissions past anything, and of course the cleaning that gets done. But anyone else, Senator?
We setting a lot of dates here, timelines, but the controlling element here is the city of Anaheim. City of Anaheim. You got to get a permit, approval from the city, from the fire department, etc. If they stall you, then what? Do you meet the deadline?
Are you asking a question? Do you want us to
Yes,
reopen? Was we
No, I don't want to
close?
I'm just saying that's what I think is going to happen. If that's going to happen, then they're locked in by what the city of Anaheim is going to do with regards to the fire department, the planning department, and those dates that may not be achievable or obtainable. And that being the case, then what should we require in this variance in terms of stipulating or stating that if the approvals are not forthcoming, then what action should we require them to take?
Well, are you wanting to have a looser variance where they have alternatives? I
You
think
might want to say
setting the date is setting the
the
date.
date should be set when the approval of local government is granted. Then it triggers, that's when it triggers those timelines. Otherwise, you have overlapping requirements that may not occur.
Senator, they built in that factor in the in items in the plan in the exhibit number 6 in the plan review. I think they factor that in. There may be some back and forth with the city, which is typically will happen. So, we won't know. The city when the city will issue the permit. Right?
Hey, you want to go forward? I have no problem. I'm telling you what happens in local government.
Yeah.
Okay, I've been there, and I tell you, they stall. We had that situation before us here before too, where local government held the project up.
And it looks like also they have built in some a factor in the construction 21 to almost 22 weeks. And I think the fact that they already have the control equipment on site, they're not waiting for the manufacturer to build it and delay there. Also, possibly with this built-in factors, they may be able to comply.
The enclosed closure on the site is temporary for current operation. They're saying enclose the building. That's what they're trying to get done. and
It's an enclosure within the building, I believe.
enclosure.
If you look on Exhibit 5, the diagram, it's the red area which is inside of the building.
That's current.
No, that's the total enclosure that they are seeking to build in compliance with Rule 1420, and also that would be part of the overall collection and control
Inside the building.
process inside the building. That's my understanding.
Well, they've heard these comments. You might want to ask them whether or not they would delay by the approval of the local government would make a difference.
I think at this point, the petitioner has presented us with a schedule that they believe to be a reasonable schedule. That's their request. I think they provided ample evidence to support the fact that this is an achievable, and obviously there's always unforeseeable events, but I think with the cushion that's been built in, if they receive anything late, then hopefully that will spur them to move the construction as quickly as possible.
Fine.
If that makes sense. Any other thoughts? Would anyone like to make a motion? Would you, Mr. Balago, would you like to make a motion and
Sure.
with
I might,
assistance if necessary?
Need help in condition 7, as Nancy was mentioned. I didn't write it completely down, so.
Actually, I have it except for the part with the consistent with, so if Ms., we'll have Ms. Feldman read it when the time comes.
Oh, okay. So then help me in here, but, okay, in the matter of the case 6122 Kinsbursky Brothers located at 1314 North Anaheim Boulevard in Anaheim, I move that we grant the regular variance. I think we are able to make all the 6 findings necessary to grant the variance, and the variance should be granted based on the condition listed in exhibit number 1 with the changes that has been proposed by Ms. Feldman. And so we need to, I didn't write down the revised number 7 completely, so.
At this time, it would be appropriate, I think, if you'd like to have Ms. Feldman read into the record both of her proposed additional conditions.
Okay, my mic is working. The light is a little iffy. Yes, I'd be happy to do that, and now that you've handed me the mic, I would also like to take the opportunity to remind the senator and other members of the board that the petitioner can always petition for a modification and extension of the variance in the hopefully unlikely event that they don't get the permit from the city of Anaheim when they anticipate that they will. The new condition number 7 should be petitioner shall complete construction of the total enclosure and associated control equipment consistent with requirements set forth in Rule 1420G no later than July 20th, 2019.
And I would add F and G. F for the control,
Yes,
for the
thank you.
control equipment.
And the new condition number 9 should read, petitioner shall conduct a source test within 45 days of completion of construction of the total enclosure and associated control equipment.
Do you want to make a reference there, Nancy, to J2 of Rule 1420? Just because it extends that time period.
I don't know if that's necessary. I'm going to augment the motion by Mr. Balagopalan or Mr. Balagopalan can do that at this once. Ms. Feldman, you're complete.
I'm finished, and yes.
May augment to include the specific rule provisions from which this variance has been granted.
Okay, sure.
Let's just finish the motion.
Go ahead.
So the specific rule portion, the specific provisions of the rule is 1420 F1B, 1420 G2B, and 1420 J2. Those are the 3 requirements that has to be met, and they're seeking the variance from. And the equipment, yeah.
If you can state the equipment is the battery dismantling and recycling system.
I see, okay. And the associated control system.
And if you finish up with excess emissions are anticipated to be,
There's no anticipated excess emissions during the period of the variance.
okay, and that completes your motion? I will second the motion. And I think, I'm wondering, Mr. Balagopalan, since there are no anticipated excess emissions, I think we should probably delete condition number 8, which was formerly condition number 8, now would be renumbered to 10, if you agree.
I agree.
Okay, so then that will become part of the motion. Any other discussion on the motion? And then I know Senator had a response to Ms. Feldman's comment. No other discussion on the motion. Senator, would you like to?
I just wanted to comment, thank Ms. Feldman for making a note of it and making it part of the record that they could file for modification. I've been here for 2.5 years, and I've seen a situation like when Anaheim did not authorize the permits in a timely fashion, therefore stall the project. And now you know if that were the case, it could happen, then you can then the petitioner can apply for a modification. I just wanted them to be aware of it. I didn't see it included, that much latitude included it in the motion that we're making, of that which we're granting them in terms of time. But maybe it's there.
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
I didn't see that much latitude for delay.
Oh, I'm sorry. I realized we didn't give a term to this variance, but we'll do that. Okay. So your discussion is you don't feel there's enough time in there?
Well, it may slip, and you got to get part of provision for that, I thought. But if you don't, then it's okay by me.
Okay. I think that well, let me first give a term, and I think it should be, and Mr. Balagopalan, because I did the calculation, I think it would be starting today and going through September 3rd, 2018. That I counted as,
June 19.
sorry, 2019. I counted that, unless I'm wrong, as 45 days after July 20th, which is that additional 10 days onto the schedule. Is that acceptable?
Yes,
Okay.
thank you.
And it's acceptable the second. I think, I agree, Senator, with what you're saying, and we always want to make sure that that our variances are feasible and that the schedules make sense. But with that said, we also don't want to grant a variance that's even longer than is requested by what the petitioner thinks is reasonable. We would rather see a petitioner try to make that schedule that they believe to be feasible. And then if they find that for reasons beyond their control, they're unable to make that, then they have to come back to the board and demonstrate why it was beyond their control, and then they can get an extension of time. So I think it makes more sense to do it that way. With that said, is there any other discussion on the motion? Otherwise, we'll vote.
And I just wanted to, we cannot direct the district staff to issue the permit a certain way. I hope they take into consideration of modifying the permit to appropriately describe the process that's going on, so that it makes it easier for compliance. Thank you.
Nice point. Okay, Senator, how do you vote?
Aye.
Dr. Lerner, how do you vote?
Yes.
Ms. Byrd, how do you vote?
Yes.
I vote yes. Mr. Balagopalan?
Yes.
Okay, motion passes 5-0. Thank you all for an excellent presentation. Board members, is there any other business? Seeing none, we are adjourned.